Finally, you'll have the chance to ask him questions by tweeting them to us at any time at Oncrawl or using the hashtag OncrawlWebinar. He'll answer them at the end of the webinar. So with that, I'll hand things over to Bill for the next 45 minutes.
Hi, welcome to the Oncrawl webinar about SEO audits, technical SEO, traffic, and looking at log files specifically, and how I wanted to focus also on how log file data really can make a difference in doing a technical SEO audit and understanding a little bit more about your site and what's going on. We're used to looking at data like Google Analytics, and honestly, the way Google Analytics works is that you put, you're probably familiar, you put a snippet of JavaScript code literally on your site, and what happens is when a visitor obviously comes to your site, it loads the JavaScript code, it fires off, and says, hey, Google, there's a visit on the site. That whole process and looking at traffic, looking at traffic from whether it's Google organic traffic or where or Bing or wherever this traffic is coming from, that assumes that you have that code installed on your web server. The difference between having Google Analytics data, which is filtered by Google. They filter out all the bots and try and tell you what the real traffic is to your site of humans. But the difference is that we have, number one, we have a website and we have to install that code. And we have to install that code on our sites, and it has to load in order for us to see a visit. Well, the log files, every web server typically has log files, and especially if you're using the site where I'm going to look at this blog, billhartzer.com. I'm going to look at today a little bit in depth and see what's going on. And with the log files, the difference is that when a visit happens, whether it's a bot or whether it's Google bot or Bing's bot or any of the search engine bots or a human visit, it records literally in a file on your web server. It records a visit, whether or not they've gone, they've loaded an image or they've loaded, what page. It records the date and time. And so let's first look at getting access. And rather than doing this live, I took some screenshots. If you go into your, assuming a lot of sites are WordPress. This is a WordPress site. It's on cPanel, which is pretty familiar. With a lot of people, a lot of sites have use cPanel. So there's in cPanel, there's a section called Raw Access, and there's a couple different ways to get access to your log files. In that raw access, you click on that raw access, you'll actually see links to, in that section, you'll actually see links to the log files. And, these are log files. You have the latest log files from today, but you also have log files that go back, typically monthly and archived monthly. This site has a while back been moved over to SSL HTTPS. So there you're going to see a log file for the regular billhartzer.com, which is HTTP traffic. I know that traffic, there's no traffic on HTTP, so everything's been moved over to HTTPS for about 2 or 3 years. So we're gonna concentrate primarily on the log files that are SSL. Okay, and that's where the traffic really comes. There's another way is you can go into, you can download those, and then these files you would then upload by FTP or drag and drop them into Oncrawl. The other way is to look at your file manager. or you can FTP, which is essentially the same as a file manager. You go in your file manager, and in that section, you've opened it up. There's a logs directory, and your normal HTTP pages are going to be under public HTML, but typically there's a section for logs, and it might be named something else, but typically in that logs folder, we're going to see all the log files, and I have log files archived back since 2014 or so, but primarily I'm focusing in on, I know these are the traffic's on SSL and HTTPS, so September, August, July, August, and September. Those are the last, essentially about the last 90 days of traffic. And so that's what I'm going to want to focus on here with Oncrawl. Essentially the process is that you download those files locally, and then you upload them by FTP and to Oncrawl, and Oncrawl then processes them and processes the data. So let's look exactly what a log file looks like. It's literally a text file. I've opened up this one from September, and in Notepad, you can use, you can open it up in Excel. You can open it up in Microsoft Word, and so forth. But it's literally just a text file, and every way log files work is that there's just recorded data, okay? And so, and we have, starts with the IP address, 108.162.219.16, and on 31st of August and this date and time, they made a request to go and look at this particular page, and this particular page, can move over a little bit. We can see that it was, 200 OK, which means that the page loaded just fine. It's not a 404 error or a redirect or anything like that. And it was Google, and supposedly Googlebot, and that they visited that page. There's another, and then later on, a few seconds, later, they went to the same page again. It's interesting to note that Google does identify themselves, and in the log file itself, it shows how much of the content how many bytes of the content they took. But it's interesting that they have not changed their identifier. They're still identifying themselves as http google.com. And so anyway, these are lines over and over, and then at the bottom here you can see Bing bot and so forth. So it's interesting to see. These are social shares. That's what a log file looks like. So we want to basically take that information, upload that to Oncrawl, and Oncrawl basically processes it and shows us essentially it's analytics. It's actually the raw analytics, and it's different than Google Analytics because Google Analytics filters all the bots out and the traffic. You're not going to see bot traffic like you're not going to see traffic like various odd bots that here's a link bot, and I probably, now that I see this, I'll probably go in after this, probably stop this particular link bot from hitting the site because it's not useful to me. I'm not sure what SEOzoom.it is. So anyway, moving on. So Google Analytics also gives you our Google Search Console. If you go into Google Search Console, you will actually be able to see in the section under crawl, this is the old version of Google Analytics. Kind of have to navigate to that and go to the crawl stats. You can see how many pages essentially they're crawling. What I'd like to note actually right here, which is interesting, is that there was a spike back in there's a spike in crawling activity, and this was September 6th, September 7th. And let's think about that, and I'm going to show you in a minute why that's important. Basically, what happens is when Google crawls, okay, when they crawl, they're showing here that there were a couple different spikes in crawling activity. This is a big one. This is a really big, happening. And so I figured out why this spike is. I know about these particular spikes, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes. But let's look at this spike. This spike actually was September 6th and September 7th. Okay. Well, it turns out on the 19th, which was several days after, obviously, which was 10, 12, 12 days after, the mobile first index was enabled for this site. It turns out that this crawling activity, I know very specifically, this crawling activity, it took 12 days. And so they crawled and they processed. And then it turns out that then after that, they notified, and a lot of sites around the 19th. But in fact, we'll go into that in a minute. In fact, I looked at the traffic, the mobile traffic from the 7th to the 25th, which is today, and the mobile traffic is up 51%, basically since this happened. So they enabled the mobile first on this site actually around September 7th, and they reported it to you 12 days later. So there is some lag time there. Let's go back over now to Oncrawl specifically, and let's look at, what I did is I took those log files. Okay, I took those log files here, and I uploaded them over to into Oncrawl. And so now we have this log file data, which are the bots. We actually have this now, and we can actually see that activity. That activity is actually, kind of, I'm going to kind of overlay, but actually we see this activity here around September 6th and September 7th. That's what Google is telling us in Search Console. Now, let's look at the actual data, okay? We have these three spikes. We have a major, this is the big spike here. This was my really big spike, which was mobile traffic. That's the actual mobile, mobile first index. Going back, these stats here are not actually accurate, because if you look, actually, Google Search Console shows us data. They're showing that the second jump was higher than the actual Oncrawl actual data that we're looking at. Okay, there was a spike. There were two spikes, actually three. We're talking about three spikes here. The second spike was higher and more, and supposedly according to Google Search Console, but in fact that's not correct. If we look at the actual bot visits from Google, okay, and these are the actual, there was a lot less pages crawled than actually this spike here. So what's interesting to note is Google will give us data in Google Search Console, but in many cases that information is not correct. I've just seen right now that they said there were big spikes. There was a big spike, but in fact it's wrong. So back to this other thing. Let's go back. We were talking about mobile first. Okay, the reason why we want to make sure our log files are put up here, because we can actually in Oncrawl we can see the bot activity, and specifically Googlebot's activity. So let's look at look at that. That was all bots. Let's basically for Googlebot. Okay, not same thing. This a lot of activity, which Google is showing clearly in Search Console, Google is showing that there was more activity. It doesn't look like if you compare that data with that data with what actually happened, Google Search Console is not correct. Let's look at Googlebot though, and specifically Googlebot Mobile. Let's look at that. There's the traffic. There's two things. We had this large spike. I'll talk about it in a minute. But actually, here's a mobile first. Here's where mobile first was implemented. I have an issue also with some log files that weren't uploaded, so that's why we're not totally seeing all the data, but we're seeing this spike. This is the mobile first, and then again, 12 days later, Google tells us about it. So they're not very, so not very in particular. We can see here's the, like I said, the same thing. 55 pages from the Google Web, but obviously mobile is there, and so we're just looking at mobile breakdown. I want to look at basically looking at all the bot traffic. So let's focus a little bit more. So that's mobile first. This activity was something that I did in particular, and I caused Google to reevaluate. So basically, I know based on different notations that I've made. Okay, I know in fact back around the beginning of August, I changed the URLs. I changed the URLs basically from billhartzer.com/pages/category name/post name, and I changed that, and I got rid of this directory called pages, and in fact now there's about 1,000 pages on the site, and now since I've changed that, we're down to Google's actually indexing of the /pages/category. I got rid of these two folders on my site, and I just made it billhartzer.com/search engine optimization, for example, okay, or billhartzer.com/domain names/post name. Both that just changing and getting rid of those two directories, okay, caused Google within a matter of a couple days, and it was changed around August 7th or so, August 8th, to do a huge amount of crawling. And obviously they see the 301 redirects, and they did that, all that crawling. So it's interesting to see that major change on the site then caused all this crawling. The second thing was that I've not investigated this second jump. I now know what the third jump is, only because of the Oncrawl and the log file data. Okay, let's look at that's the log monitoring area specifically, and the crawl behavior. But what's the SEO impact? Okay, I want to dig in a little bit more and look specifically at at the SEO visits. And basically the SEO visits are meaning that it actually that is the Google Analytics data, where SEO visits are that's what Oncrawl talks about. SEO visits mean human visitors. So we had during this period, we have the number of visits. We have actually SEO active pages. These are separate pages on the site where there's traffic. I know there's about over 1,000 pages on the site. So one thing I would want to look into is why there's a difference. Why there are 400 pages that basically aren't getting a lot of traffic, okay, a certain percentage. Then we're also actually looking at fresh rank, and there's a delay, okay. This actually gives you some information. This actually is the time between when Google first crawls a page and when that page actually begins to get traffic. So there are, I know it in this case, in this site, it takes basically about 71 days in order for the pages on the average to get ranked well. So there are and that's there are blog posts that I will post and promote on social that then they will fairly quickly rank fairly well, but the majority of the pages, it takes time, and there are ways to speed up the process, and basically that process would be essentially getting links from other sites to those pages. I'm not actively pursuing links on this site at all. I just don't get links on this site. I don't do any link building. I get links because of the content, not because I'm actually going out heavily promoting posts. Let's see, just going through different reports, I'm going to kind of spot to see, how many, if there's any other information I can gather. Let's look at a couple of different areas. So basically so in this particular case, I'm looking at all of the, looking at the whole, all of this information. I'm looking also at, what, apparently there are bots are going to actually a certain number of pages that have 404 errors or 410 errors. And I know I do have pages that are 404s. I don't think there are pages on this site that are linked internally, but that's something that we definitely want to investigate, based on the crawl report. So there are bot hits going to 404 errors, which is kind of a concern. The same thing with there also is a concern here with, like I said, 1,300 hits during this is a whole period for 90 days or so, but that is also a concern to look into. And so as I'm going through, kind of starting to begin to audit and look at this data, I'm actually, my process personally, I have Notepad or Word or Microsoft Excel, typically Notepad open, and I will be making notes like this to look into specifically things like this. Why are there bot hits on pages or resources on the site that are delivering 400, 404 errors or 410 errors? Not too, it doesn't look, obviously the server is not having a problem. There are also redirects. I know that pages have changed, so there may be some internal links that need to be fixed. But there are, this is a concern based on 1,300 visits total, and so forth. Definitely going to make a note of that. So going into the crawl report, one of the areas that I wanted to make sure I look at here is actually, there's a couple different reports that I have pulled up, and I've filtered out, and I've been going through a lot of this, the log monitoring, and a lot of this reports. There are certain reports that are very helpful that I've pulled out. And one of them is the SEO Active Pages with balances and a high load time. And the other ones are, they all have kind of their some of them are SEO Active Orphan Pages, and the orphans. One of the things that I can find is based on analytics and based on combining a crawl and analytics and log files are essentially pages that are, for example, active, that have traffic based on the log files and log file data. And in fact, in this case, it looks to me like there are hits, Googlebot hits actually, and for some reason, also, now granted, this is over 90 days. So there's not a lot of traffic over 90 days. But in fact, for example, there are, there's each one of the categories on this WordPress site actually has a feed. And so there are visits. And Google's only visiting a few of them, which is fine because they're not really very important pages, but nonetheless they are there, and they're actually SEO. What Oncrawl is saying is seeing as SEO visits. I don't recall if there is Google Analytics code on the /feed URLs, at each and some of these pages. These are actually, some of this traffic is showing up because of the fact that these were old pages and I had actually changed, those URLs, and we're seeing that. But that's something to investigate, why these feed pages are showing up in the site. So this is something that you're going to see with log file data, and not necessarily. This is an RSS feed, so I do not think that Google Analytics would show this data. This is something that, again, when you're going in and really digging into a site, having 60 visits on a page that's a feed, that is something that either, number one, the feeds need to come down or redirected, or basically in this case, I would probably just completely should take these down. There's other different reports that I've pulled that have to do with log files. And if we, for example, and I'm personally interested in orphan pages. Those are the active pages based on the log files that actually have, that have errors. Okay. So in fact, we go back and actually I'm seeing some of these feed pages are giving 404s. For some reason, there are visits based on log files, log file data. There's traffic, and you start adding up all of this traffic going to the /feed pages. There's traffic that could be had. In this case, it's feed. It could be other pages that you have on a site. That happens specifically. Tends to happen a lot when we redesign sites, or when sites are redesigned. That if a migration has not been done properly, and it just happens all the time. Happens even with our own sites. We change the URLs. We change. We go from, for example, .html pages. I have literally pages that from 2001 that I created that still have traffic, and then are, billhartzer.com/whatever.html, and that does not have Google Analytics code because Google Analytics didn't exist at that time, but they still are indexed and have traffic. And so your log files like this are going to show this particular type of data. Let's see. What I want to do is actually look at rankings. So when we think of rankings, this data for rankings really has to do with, it pulls from Google Search Console and the Google Search Console data. And so we're assuming that Google Search Console is showing us, ranking. So when we look at this data here, look under search. This is the old Search Console, but we look at Search Analytics, and Google reports clicks, impressions, click-through ratio, and position. And we can actually change this. I'm going to change this to the last 90 days and actually see the queries. So these were the impressions, average click-through ratio, and the average position. And so we have this data: how many clicks, how many impressions, and the position. When there is a position, typically I always rank for my name. I don't know why Google should really put 1.0 here, but the position will sometimes change depending on a lot of different factors. Sometimes you'll look here and say, hey, I'm number 1 for something, and you go and search for it, and you won't be on the first page. It happens. I mean, but so that data doesn't necessarily jive with, and it's not necessarily the same as the actual rankings that we have. But we actually go back to this Oncrawl data, and there's 1,800 pages that are ranking, that Google Search Console says that we're ranking. So in fact, that's something I want to look into also, because we have 1,800 pages. How many pages are there crawling? 13,000 unique pages. But we go back to the the ranking report, and we see basically there's 1,800 pages that are ranking, and this is obviously the last 90 days. 1,700 pages are ranking without a click. So basically, that could be because of the fact that it's ranking, and I'm not sure when the definition of ranking. It could be that it's pages 1,700 those 1,700 pages are ranking on the second, third, fourth, or fifth page of the search results, or even worse. And so they won't get clicks. And basically, we won't get clicks unless we're, for a lot of phrases, unless it's ranking on the first or second page. If it's really, really popular keyword, somebody might, you might get some traffic on the second, if you're ranking on the second or third page, but typically that's not the case. So let's go back, so basically, let's see if there's anything related to log files, and what the types of pages I want to mention here. Actually, impressions, click-through ratio, and clicks. This is not necessarily related to log files, but in fact, what I've done is you see, and I mentioned before, I changed the site. Basically, it was the URLs which caused all that additional crawling activity back in August. Now they're pretty much over that, and they've changed all the URLs. And those have 301 redirects from the old ones to the new ones. And so it's billhartzer.com/pages. Luckily now we're not really seeing, which is good, much traffic or rankings, on that. we're seeing some because some of this data is when those pages were actually in place. A lot of the traffic and the rankings tend to be on the search engine pages, which are ranking 21st to 100th position. And so that's interesting to me because that's one of my more popular topics, and that I blog about are search engines. And so those pages tend to to rank fairly well. The pages on on social media, which I don't have a lot of pages, but for those keywords, there are some. So in fact, these are just overall looking at, Google does really, really well. So those are the topics that I need to continue, to continue to write about, because, anything Google tends to rank well. These, what I've done is there is a way to configure your pages, and worth mentioning. And so basically, you can segment your pages into, and this is done automatically, but you can actually, you can edit some of these filters. You can, so basically, what on this particular site, these are the different directories that I have, and these are the major sections of the site, and there obviously are a lot of other pages, and so I believe you have up to 15 different categories, so I can add some more sections. And what's really, in the home directory is important. Another thing that's important to look at and make a note of. And so, I wanted to see actually in the home directory, okay, now what's really going on. And some of this can be filtered out. Some of this actually is cache data, is basically cache data, and so this needs to be filtered out. And so there are basically there's traffic on these three different versions of the home page, and then a lot of other pages. And so this filtering here, I can add some more filters to actually filter out anything that has question mark __ HS FP. I use a couple of different caching on this site is on Cloudflare, but it also is using WordFence, and WordFence and some tends to sometimes put in some extra URLs. And so this is actually most likely from the log file data. That's why it's showing up. So if we go back to, we go back to the project, and we go back here. Let's go back to the actual project. We're looking at, the crawl, looking at, let's see, we're looking at the the rankings, and the ranking report specifically. So basically, I want to focus a little bit more. We got about 5 more minutes, and until we run into some questions. Ranking in Googlebot. So basically, we want to look at rankings. Basically, are the ranking data from Google Search Console, and we want to look at comparing these pages that are in the site structure. In the site structure, which means that specifically, that means that these pages are linked on the site. The pages, when you go to the home page and you click on the navigation, you're going to click on a page, and you're going to find another page, another page, another page. Okay, those are the pages that are basically in the current site structure, which is 1,700 pages. There are so as we start to dig into this data and look at pages that are in the site structure that are being crawled actively by Google. Okay, let's look at this. this is only data that you're going to get from the log files and putting this into Oncrawl. Pages that are in the site structure, there are 1,712 pages, but in fact, Google's only, in past 90 days, Google has only crawled 1,300 pages. Where are these 400 pages that Google's not crawling, but they're on the site? You can click from the home page to another page to find that page, but for some reason, Google is not crawling those. That's something that I'm going to make a note of and say and figure out. That's fairly significant. There's a difference. Why, I need to understand why Google's not crawling those pages. They're there, they're linked. There could be a couple of reasons. One reason in particular could be the fact that Google has been told not to crawl them. That could be because of the Robasa text file. There are certain sections or certain areas like the WP admin section in particular, with and certain directories that basically don't want Google to crawl. So that can be logical, but it's something I want to verify. I want to verify that, okay, where are these 400 pages? What are they? And so we can look in this particular data on Oncrawl and see. What's also concerning though is there's 846 pages that are ranked in Google, but we know there's 1,700 pages on the site. So what's the difference between these pages that are on the site and these that are actually ranked? Does it matter? It doesn't matter that they're not ranked on the home page, on the first page of search results, but they're literally not ranked like in the top 100, 200, whatever. They're not ranked in Google. So for some reason, so this information is actually pretty critical as well, is to understanding. So basically, we get into other information about ranking pages and so forth. But basically, this is one area. I could go on actually, honestly, for a while. I think we've got about 2 minutes left. So again, going back, I'd like to actually, go back and just review a little bit about, cPanel. Obviously, we can get access to our log files. We can get those into Oncrawl. We want to continue, there's a couple different ways we can download them, and we can actually look at them in particular, look at them specifically. When you get hundreds of visits to your site, there's literally not any use to looking at the log files in particular. But unless there are certain pages, that you have an issue with. The crawl stats, I'd like to mention though, it's critical to understand that the crawl stats that Google shows you is not actually technically the same crawl stats or crawl data that Google is actually crawling based on the log file. And again, mobile first index was interesting to show, and you can only see that data unless you have log files combined with the Google Analytics data and Google Search Console data. We can get into a lot more different reports, and we can start to look in to see pages on sites that are orphan pages that have backlinks. But again, if it's at all possible, I really do recommend making sure that you get log file data and putting it into Oncrawl. So I think we're now at a point where we can have some questions. I'm going to look at some specifics to see if So so I'm going to go through some questions here in particular. Can we create, let's see, can we create segments with Oncrawl? Not sure what you mean by segments, but in fact, what I did mention, obviously, was that we can create different sections. For example, I have a section of my site that is all of my search engine posts, different categories. And so if there's one particular category, if we can narrow it down based on URL structure, so if there are certain pages in an e-commerce site, we would have our category pages and our product pages. And so those would be in two different folders or two different directories. And so it's fairly easy to segment that data to what, if we want to look specifically at product pages, or we want to look at even one particular category that is not performing, for example, we can actually start to look into that area. And if, say, for example, one particular category of products, are getting are not getting crawled, or one particular segment of your data and is not performing, not selling, you can start to look and see if those pages are getting crawled. So there's we can do a lot of segmentation. What I really like about Oncrawl is that we can basically create and compare just about any data with any data, from anything from that we can pull from analytics or log files or Google Search Console, or actually the crawl itself.
I'm going to jump in there for a second, Bill, and just mention that we can create segmentations in Oncrawl for pretty much any of the metrics that you see anywhere in the interface. So you can segment your entire website by whatever is important to you, and then view all of the images, all of the charts, and all of your data based on those segmentations. One of the following questions we had was, what is the difference between pages and resources? Do you want to answer that, Bill?
Really, there's not. There's really not. I would say resources would be more about images, I understand, or actually just. I don't think there's really any difference between those. Resources basically is, a hit on a page or a URL.
Yeah, so resources, like you said, are most of it is images, but you might also have other types of files that are sent to either bots or users that are looking at your web page. And the page is actually the page itself. So if in a page you load other resources, those are classified as resources.
So one thing I'd like to actually point out is a lot of when I have a lot of very large audits I've done, and fairly recently, and through Oncrawl. And one of the things that is extremely important to note with log files in particular is that a lot of sites use PDFs and the Adobe Acrobat file format, and it just comes down to it that you cannot put Google Analytics on a PDF file. And so one particular, that would be a resource. And if you're not using log files, you're not going to have that data. You might have it in ranking in Google Search Console data, but in fact, it's important to get the log files, especially if you have PDFs, because you can actually see which PDFs are getting visits, are getting crawled, and are ranking. And in that case, because you don't have Google Analytics on the PDF. And so there were cases where I was able to recommend to certain site owners that they they were getting a lot of traffic on certain PDFs and they didn't know about that. And so what we decided to do was, as a result of looking at the Oncrawl data, we decided to do was basically change the URL of the PDF, and when somebody requested that page, it would essentially go to a regular HTML, HTML type page, and then they would fill out a form to download the PDF. And so there was some changes that we made based on the fact that certain PDFs were ranking.
That's a great example, Bill, of the difference between a page and a resource. So your PDF is your resource, but that URL that you created that actually is a page is your page. That's a way of differentiating between the two. We had a couple questions as well about the feed pages that you mentioned earlier. Were you able to figure out what was causing visits on them, or not yet?
I have not in particular. I think that I think what's happening is there's those. I do know that there are other sites that are syndicating, or trying to syndicate those feed pages,
Okay.
and there may be some links to those pages, but that's something I definitely need to look into.
Okay. The next question about that was, is there a way to exclude pages like that from our reports? So if we're looking at an on-call report, can we not see hits on those feed pages? Do you want to answer that, or would you like me to?
Yes, I mean, you can definitely exclude that data. There's a couple different ways and different, in different, in the segmentation, and when you actually are looking at that, you can segment the data based on the fact that you want to look at certain pages, but that do not, but you don't want to include that /feed, any pages that have /feed. But again, I do think that while you can segment that data and look at it differently, when it comes down to looking at it, you need to understand why you can just ignore /feed, but you need to look at the root problem. Is there, why are those even, why are those posts, or why are those /feed pages even showing up and being requested? Do they need a 301, or you need to, 404 those pages in particular?
Yeah. You can focus on those pages or exclude them when you're looking at results in the Data Explorer by adding a line to the on-call query language filters at the top of the page. So even if you don't want to go to the extent of segmenting to be able to see or not see them, you can just add a line in the filter as well. We also had a question. You mentioned earlier that you make notations that you use to look at something later. What type of events do you make notations for when you're looking at what happens on your website?
So basically, the notations, that I create basically are in I do it a lot in Google Analytics, and even if something, you can make those notations based on just about any kind of event. I'd rather make a notation that, oh well, I may, it could be simple, something like I changed the title tag on this particular page, and that you make that notation, because then 2 or 3 months later, all of a sudden you see that page start to rank or get a bunch of traffic. You have that notation. The same, so there's not necessarily any specific guideline to making notations, but I do like to notate things. I'd rather have the data noted, and notated and noted somewhere, rather than not having it and trying to figure out later, hey, well, what happened on on August 27th, what, and then have to go back through and figure out what kind of changes we made to the site or something like that.
Okay, thanks so much for sharing your expertise there. I think we have time for one last question, or if you have one last thing you'd like to share with us. What's the one takeaway you'd like us to keep from today's webinar, Bill?
I think that, I think that when it comes down to it, we have a lot of things that, that won't necessarily, that will drive our reasoning about why something happens or why something is ranking, or or why traffic is going to certain pages. And it really comes down to that you have to have the accurate data, and don't, and if you look at something in Google Analytics and something weird is going on, or you lost traffic, or or there's, or you need to understand why and what happened, and get access to log files, get access to, put that data into a tool like Oncrawl, and let the data tell you specifically why something is happening. And so, if I was digging around in analytics and saying, oh, well, all of a sudden my mobile traffic went up 50%, well, we can go into that data and let the data tell us that the reason why it went up was because of the mobile first index. And so we need to understand that just because we have ideas and things about, and questions or preconceived ideas, we need to get down and dirty and look at the data and let that tell us what is actually going on.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bill. I think that'll end the webinar for today. This webinar will be up on YouTube tomorrow. So if you missed something and want to check something out again, or if you missed a part and want to go over it, you'll have the opportunity to do that on our YouTube channel tomorrow. Thanks for coming, and we hope you had a good time. Thank you again, Bill, for participating.
Thanks.
And
it was fun.
Great. Thanks very much. Have a good day, everyone.
Cheers.